That one glorious word represents more than just the geography between the Sabine and the Rio Grande. It represents a unique idea and way of life. A life of rugged individualism, proud self-reliance, gritty toughness, and fierce independence. That is what made Texas, and that is what will save her again. Howdy, folks. Sam Houston here. I want to thank you for tuning into the Feed Bandit podcast. Feed Bandit is the Texas first outdoors brand built by rabid Texans, for rabid Texans, and all those who aim to be one someday. We unapologetically promote the ideals that shape our Texas pride and Texas first patriotism through our love of hunting, the outdoors, and the gear and apparel we create. Texas, above all else, preserve the tradition, protect the legacy. Check us out at feedbandit.com. And to repeat that great rallying cry from a former colleague of mine, liberty or death. Now, enough of my talking. Here are a couple of bandits that love Texas as much as I do. Enjoy.
Howdy, friend. Welcome back to the Feed Bandit podcast. Jimmy back with you. And on this edition, we're going to continue our series on TEXIT, or Leave the Swamp, as I like to call it. That's where we are reviewing the book called TEXIT by Daniel Miller, where he lays out his reasoning for why Texas should leave the Union and why Texas would be better off if she did leave the Union. So we'll get into that, but first, let's learn a little bit more about Texas history itself. In this month, January, in 1839, it was the beginning or the modification of Lone Star heraldry. That's a hard word to say, obviously, as my tongue gets tied on occasion, as you are very well versed at probably listening to on these missives. But on this day, which would be January 25th, in 1839, the Republic of Texas Congress adopted the Texas Coat of Arms after initial hopes for the quick annexation of Texas into the United States grew dim. The Third Congress modified the seal and introduced the design of a national arms in 1839. Quote, a white star of 5 points on an azure ground, encircled by an olive and live oak branches. End quote. The Congress specified that the Great Seal of this Republic shall bear the arms of this nation and the letters Republic of Texas. The Texan legation in Paris used a variation of this seal with the national arms encircled by Texian Legation Paris. Though no one knows who first suggested the addition of the olive and live oak branches to the seal, the Mexican national seal was the likely source. Senator William H. Wharton introduced a bill in the Texas Senate on December 28, 1838, to modify both the Texas seal and the flag. The bill was referred to a committee chaired by Senator Oliver Jones, and on January 25, 1839, President Mirabeau B. Lamar approved a substitute bill offered by Jones, which proposed the same design for the seal and flag originally presented in Wharton's bill. Peter Cragg executed an official rendition of the seal as well as the national flag. Lamar approved Cragg's art, which is attached to the act, and currently in the custody of the Texas State Archives. Cragg erroneously used either Spanish oak or post oak leaves in his seal art, instead of live oak leaves. However, thus initiating more than a century of debate over the seal's correct design. In 1845, the designation was altered from republic to state. I did not realize that there was I guess I didn't look close enough to the seal or what it looked like back then to notice that it wasn't live oak leaves. Didn't realize there was a giant hullabaloo about all that. That's pretty interesting. All right, let's get back into the book TEXIT by Daniel Miller. This would be episode 8 of this series, And this is starting in Chapter 4 called Project Fear. And it starts with a quote. The hopes of the usurper were inspired by belief that the citizens of Texas were disunited and divided in opinion. That alone has been the cause of the present invasion of our rights. He shall realize the fallacy of his hopes in the union of our citizens, in their eternal resistance to his plans against constitutional liberty. We will enjoy our birthright, or perish in its defense. Unquote. And that was from the Proclamation of Sam Houston and a Call for Volunteers, December 12th, 1835. In September of 2014, the people of Scotland went to the polls to determine their future by answering one simple question. Should Scotland be an independent country? Centuries of longing for independence and decades of successful political struggle had been reduced to 6 words on a piece of paper. The simplicity of the question betrayed the complexity behind the decision each Scot was being asked to make. In the years ahead of the actual vote, the issue was hotly debated. The Scottish National Party had included the referendum as a major part of their election manifesto in the 2 previous general elections, and worked hard to make good on the promise. When the legal wrangling was over and a date for the referendum was set, 2 official campaigns emerged. Yes, Scotland, in favor of independence, and Better Together, in favor of remaining a part of the United Kingdom. On the first anniversary of the launch of the Better Together campaign, the Sunday Herald newspaper claimed, privately, some inside Better Together even referred to the organization as Project Fear. The name came from the acknowledgement that the primary tactic of Better Together was scaremongering. Indeed, fear is the favorite tactic of those in power who wish to motivate people to take a specific action, or, in the case of Scotland and Texas, prevent them from asserting independence. Project Fear arguments in regard to TEXIT tend to fall into one of 3 broad categories. 1. TEXIT is illegal. 2. They won't let us. 3. TEXIT is too hard. Gathered together into a single statement, the total argument flows along these lines. Quote, Texas can't leave the Union because it's illegal and unconstitutional. The Civil War settled it. Therefore, if Texas tried, the federal government would never let us. Even if it wasn't illegal, we are far too integrated with the United States, making it impossible to leave. But even if we were to somehow magically pull it off, we're simply not big enough or strong enough outside the United States to be successful. We'd be bankrupt in 10 years and begging the United States to let us back in. Unquote. The tenor of these arguments represents the fundamental problem with the vast majority of objections raised by TEXIT opponents. When the Texas version of Project Fear is confronted with facts and logic, facts and logic that concretely rebut its arguments, or information that throws its conclusions and assumptions into question, it ignores the results and shifts to a different argument. Unable to keep its arguments from being shot down, the Project Fear strategy can be summed up in one sentence. Scare them as much as possible, as often as possible, and if you keep moving, they'll eventually miss. TEXIT is illegal and unconstitutional. A common accusation by those opposed to TEXIT is that the act of leaving the Union is illegal. Let's be clear. An accusation of the commission of an illegal act implies that those committing it are criminals guilty of a criminal act. Therefore, this is not a light accusation. When pressed, however, no one seems to be able to point to a specific law that forbids it. Scouring the federal statutes produces no joy for the accuser, as there is no law that explicitly forbids any state from asserting its independence. And I'll just say, not that it matters. Given the passion with which this accusation is leveled, if it is not found in federal law, then surely it must exist in Texas statute. After all, the state of Nevada included one of the most strongly worded prohibitions on secession in its state constitution. Quote, but the paramount allegiance of every citizen is due to the federal government in the exercise of all its constitutional powers as the same have been or may be defined by the Supreme Court of the United States. And no power exists in the people of this or any other state of the federal union to dissolve their connection therewith or perform any act tending to impair, subvert, or resist the supreme authority of the government of the United States. Unquote. However, there is no corresponding constitutional or statutory prohibition in Texas law either. It is a fundamental principle of American jurisprudence that something is illegal only if there is a law forbidding it. This is known as the legality principle, expressed in Latin as nullum crimen sine lege, nulla poena sine lege, meaning no crime without law, nor punishment without law. Paul H. Robinson, one of the world's leading criminal law scholars, described its modern application in 2005. Quote, "In its modern form, it means that criminal liability and punishment can be based only upon a prior legislative enactment of a prohibition that is expressed with adequate precision and clarity. The principle is not a legal rule, but rather a legal concept embodied in a series of legal doctrines." Unquote. If no law specifically prohibits a state from leaving the Union, then there must be some other law which, in their minds, applies this instance. When pressed further, the accusation shifts to that of treason. Not reason. Treason. The term treason has become an increasingly popular charge in this divisive political climate. While TEXIT advocates are the recipients of it at a higher than average rate, it has become far more common in federal partisan wrangling. Obama was accused of treason over the Iran nuclear deal, and Trump has been accused of treason for his alleged ties to the Russian government. However, those who seem to be quickest to use the term seem to be the most clueless as to its meaning. Drawing from an English statute from 1351 that was created to limit the scope of treason, the framers of the United States Constitution included a specific definition in Article 3, Section 3, which stated that treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Remember that. That's an interesting definition, which, in my opinion, could be applied to Abraham Lincoln, but I digress. The levying war against them part. Continuing, recognizing that accusations of treason were often the tool of tyrants, James Madison explained the necessity to clearly define it in Federalist 43. As, quote, "As treason may be committed against the United States, the authority of the United States ought to be enabled to punish it. But as new, tangled, and artificial treasons have been the great engines by which violent factions, the natural offspring of free governments, have usually wreaked their alternate malignity on each other, the Convention has with great judgment opposed a barrier to this particular danger by inserting a constitutional definition of the crime." End quote. Treason is a criminal act committed by an individual, not a political body, and therefore cannot be committed by a state. To continue to level the charge of treason, one must believe that the entirety of the population of Texas who would vote in support of TEXIT would be individually guilty of treason. This, however, completely ignores the constitutional definition of treason. Such a vote is not levying war against the United States unless one considers casting a ballot as an act of war, nor is it adhering to or giving aid and comfort to an enemy of the United States. If so, who would that enemy be? An enemy of the United States is someone who has been declared as such by the United States Congress, generally through a formal declaration of war. In this instance, North Korea might perhaps fit the bill, since the Korean War was never formally concluded. According to Carlton F. W. Larson, a professor of law at the University of California at Davis, quote, "Certain non-state actors can also count as enemies, and terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and Islamic State probably fit the definition." Unquote. Adhering to the enemy would mean that voting for TEXIT was, in fact, joining North Korea or the Islamic State. Giving aid and comfort would mean that voting for TEXIT was, in fact, providing concrete and material support to the same. Neither of these apply. When confronted with the lack of basis for the charge of treason, the final charge is that of attempting to overthrow the government. In fairness, there is a federal statute in Title 18 of the U.S. Code that outlaws attempts to do that very thing. In its entirety, it reads, "Whoever knowingly or willfully advocates, abets, advises, or teaches the duty, necessity, desirability, or propriety of overthrowing or destroying the government of the United States or the government of any state, territory, district, or possession thereof, or the government of any political subdivision therein, by force or violence, or by the assassination of any officer of any such government, or whoever, with the intent to cause the overthrow or destruction of any such government, prints, publishes, edits, issues, circulates, sells, distributes, or publicly displays any written or printed manner advocating, advising, or teaching the duty, necessity, desirability, or propriety of overthrowing or destroying any government in the United States by force or violence, or attempts to do so. Or whoever organizes or helps or attempts to organize any society, group, or assembly of persons who teach, advocate, or encourage or the overthrow or destruction of any such government by force or violence, or becomes or is a member of or affiliates with any such society, group, or assembly of persons, knowing the purposes thereof, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 20 years, or both, and shall be ineligible for employment by the United States or any department or agency thereof for 5 years next following his conviction. Unquote. The operative words in the statute are force or violence, and given that a TEXIT initiated by a legal process rather than by a vote of the people of Texas, ratified by a vote of the people of Texas, and secured by a declaration of the reclamation of the right of self-determination, is neither force nor violence. This accusation falls as well. Once the argument of illegality lies in ruins, the fallback position is to loudly declare that it is unconstitutional for a state to leave the Union. However, the accusation of unconstitutionality shares a fundamental and fatal flaw with the accusation of illegality. There is not a single clause in the Constitution of the United States that forbids Texas, or any state for that matter, from leaving the Union. In this case, the constitutional silence is extremely important. The Constitution of the United States actually defines the specific acts states are forbidden from committing in Article 1, Section 10. Quote, "No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payments of debt, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility." Continuing, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports, except what may be absolutely necessary for executing its inspection laws, and the net produce of all duties and imposts laid by any state on imports or exports shall be for the use of the Treasury of the United States, and all such laws shall be subject to the revision and control of Congress. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in times of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state, or with a foreign power, or engage in war unless actively invaded, or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. End quote. Nowhere in the remainder of the Constitution is the issue of a state leaving the Union explicitly forbidden, nor is power ceded to the federal government to prohibit one from doing so. In this silence, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution rings loudly. Quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." This deafening constitutional silence, coupled with the definitive reservation of power by the states, leaves the decision to the people of the state and to those people alone. Not so fast, say the critics. What about the Supreme Court case of Texas v. White? Didn't that say secession was unconstitutional? The entire legal argument for the unconstitutionality of states leaving the Union rests on the Supreme Court's decision in the 1869 case of Texas v. White. However, when it comes to Texas v. White, more and more academics are adopting the stance of historian Dr. Brian McClanahan, who actually has an amazing podcast that you should listen to, by the way. The Brian McClanahan Show. When asked that very question at an academic conference in Florida, his response was an indignant, "So what?" Dr. McClanahan's attitude towards Texas v. White is not based on a denial of facts. In fact, contrary to the concrete pronouncements by TEXIT detractors, the decision in Texas v. White has been debated and debunked extensively starting from the moment Chief Justice Solomon P. Chase issued the majority opinion. The dissenting opinion, issued by Justice Robert C. Greer, highlighted many of the deficiencies of the Supreme Court's ruling, stating that he disagreed on all points raised and decided. The assertions made by Chase were so offensive to his contemporaries that Union and Confederate sympathizers both fresh from the battlefields and still harboring deep divisions, were united in their contempt for his ruling. Bristling at the usurpation by the judiciary of the power to determine political questions, Lyman Trumbull, a United States Senator from Illinois, introduced legislation that in part stated, quote, "Under the Constitution, the judicial power of the United States does not embrace political power or give to judicial tribunals any authority to question the political departments of the government on political questions." End quote. There is no doubt that Chief Justice Chase, an appointee of Abraham Lincoln, used the opportunity presented by Texas v. White to stamp a retroactive seal of approval on the federal government's policies and actions during the Civil War, or War for Southern Independence. To do so, Chase had to rewrite history and virtually all established law on the subject. To reinforce his belief that the United States was a, quote, perpetual union, he had to assert the ludicrous argument that the United States Constitution was merely an amending document to the previous Articles of Confederation, citing the preamble to the Constitution. He then had to ignore that it only took 9 states of the original 13 to ratify the Constitution of 1787, and that, had less than 13 states ratified, it would have destroyed the perpetual union allegedly created by the Articles of Confederation. To reinforce his assertion that the United States was an indestructible union composed of indestructible states, Chase had to ignore the existence of West Virginia and the agreement with the Republic of Texas upon its admission, that it could divide into 4 additional states and that those additional states would be guaranteed admission into the Union if they so choose. To reinforce his assertion that states, upon entering the Union, gave up all rights of sovereignty and became incorporated in a single monolithic superstate, Chase had to ignore every reference to the states as individual political entities in the Declaration of Independence, the aforementioned Articles of Confederation, the Northwest Ordinance, the United States Constitution, and all intent of the framers clearly expressed in the period. In his zeal to confirm the supremacy of the Union, Chase ascribed qualities to it that are usually reserved for deities. In effect, he equated the Union to God and established a quasi-religious orthodoxy that requires adherence to a doctrine that elevates the federal government to godhood. Its three branches to the Holy Trinity, and the judiciary as its holy priesthood. There is no doubt that had the states been exposed to Chase's logic during deliberations over the ratification of the Constitution, they would have soundly rejected it and likely drafted a new Declaration of Independence. The Supreme Court was not and will never be perfect. Some of the most heinous, morally reprehensible, logically flawed decisions have emanated from the Supreme Court. To imbue it with infallibility is to say that when it upheld slave catching or when it upheld racial segregation, it was right. Yet decisions by the court in both of those instances have been overturned. Even Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., in the 1904 case of Northern Securities Company v. United States, recognized that the court could be caught up in the politics and passions of the day and render bad decisions. Quote, "Great cases like hard cases make bad law. For great cases are called great, not by reason of their importance, but because of some accident of immediate overwhelming interest which appeals to the feelings and distorts the judgment." With all its obvious flaws, some academics continue to point to Texas v. White as the silver bullet that handles all questions related to states separating from the Union. However, others tend to glide over it so as not to have to acknowledge its most significant problem. Embracing Texas v. White requires one to believe that the last 150 years never happened. Since 1869, the world kept spinning. Generations have come and gone, and the Supreme Court has continued to issue rulings that chip away at the foundations of Texas v. White. As the entirety of Chase's determination is predicated on the claim that perpetual union is the more perfect union spoken of in the preamble of the Constitution, the single ruling by the court in the 1905 case of Jacobson v. Massachusetts, where it was determined that the federal government can gain no powers based on the preamble, could utterly destroy Texas v. White. The federal government's position on self-determination has evolved to the point of signing international agreements, covenants, and treaties pledging to respect the right of self-determination. The same chorus of voices who declare that Texas v. White is the end-all be-all of decisions on the matter of self-determination of the states are the same voices who declare that subsequent rulings by the Supreme Court obligate the federal government and the states to give treaty obligations, such as those dealing with self-determination, the same weight as constitutional law and argue for its application as such. Ultimately, though, any question of self-determination is political in nature. It is not and never will be a judicial question. Perhaps recognizing this fact and hoping to avoid any serious examination of the constitutionality of the question in general, and Texas v. White specifically, those opposed to TEXIT quickly move on to their next argument. Justice Antonin Scalia is often cited using the next argument. Taken from a letter written to an aspiring screenwriter, Scalia declared, quote, "If there was any constitutional issue resolved by the Civil War, it is that there is no right to secede," unquote. This is also a sentiment echoed by Paul Finkelman, a senior fellow in the Penn Program on Democracy, Citizenship, and Constitutionalism at the University of Pennsylvania, and a scholar in residence at the National Constitution Center, in a 2015 column in the New York Times. Quote, "In short, nullification and secession were not new ideas in 1861, when 11 states left the Union, but had been part of the warp and weft of constitutional debate since the founding. But the Civil War," and I say that like in quotes because the supposed Civil War was not a civil war. Just remember that. "Ended the discussion. The question of the constitutionality of nullification or secession was permanently settled by the legal case of Lee v. Grant, decided at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. This refrain is echoed more often than any other, and is where fear truly enters into the strategy of Project Fear. It is a quick retort that is meant to stifle all further debate on the issue through intimidation. Let's be honest. The assertions of the illegality or constitutionality of a state leaving the Union, and that the quote-unquote Civil War settled the issue, although often linked, are truly two separate and distinct arguments. The former deals with a point of law that can be discussed, debated, and definitive conclusions reached. The latter is a thinly veiled threat of violence often used as a tactic by bullies, abusers of women and children, and tin-pot dictators propping up tyrannical regimes. However, this argument also poses a significant legal, political, and moral problem for the United States and the world. If the military conquest of the states that seceded during the 1860s was the point at which the question of leaving the Union was settled, does this mean that all political questions, especially those related to self-determination, are deemed as perpetually solved by the use of force? In a larger geopolitical sense, think about how that principle have played out in the 20th century. When Germany invaded Poland, touching off the Second World War, how much different would the world be if the response from the United States was, quote, "I guess that settles that," unquote? Or Japan's successful invasion of the Philippines. MacArthur's response was, "I shall return." It wasn't, "It is now settled that the Philippines are now an indivisible and inseparable part of the Empire of Japan." Advocates of this line of thinking are missing the forest for the trees. If the Civil War truly did settle the issue, then no one would even be discussing it. It would be a fact. Establishment politicians, academia, and the media throw around the world consensus as though everyone agrees that the Civil War, quote-unquote, settled the issue, and that anyone who disagrees is an outlier. Take, for instance, Harvey Tucker, political science professor at Texas A&M, whose position on the matter has been parroted by other professors and regurgitated by a lazy media. According to Tucker, quote, "Among scholars, the consensus is that the Civil War settled all these issues. Texas does not have the right to secede." End quote. Come on, Aggies. Tucker, and those like him, ignore the ongoing scholarship of the issue and instead opt for a soundbite followed by a definitive declaration. The media largely ignores the numerous academic conferences held over the last 20 years dealing with the right of secession, the impact of international law on the right of self-determination, and the constitutional history of secession, many of them taking place in the United States with notable U.S. scholars. If the quote-unquote Civil War definitively and decisively settled the issue of separation from the Union, apparently the larger academic community didn't get the memo. The TEXIT question, though, is not one that is left solely to academics and their discussions of political and legal theory. Where it matters most on this political question is not whether the quote-unquote Civil War settled it, but whether the people of Texas believe that a question was settled that they've never been properly asked. The growth of support for TEXIT clearly shows that fewer and fewer Texans consider the result of the quote-unquote Civil War the final answer to the independence question. And that's the end of that section, and the end for now on this podcast. We'll continue and finish Chapter 4 of TEXIT in the next edition of this Leave the Swamp series. But I do want to just add my color a little bit to this whole idea of the Civil War settling it. And I said it wasn't a civil war. Well, of course it wasn't. A civil war is a war between two factions fighting for control of a government. And what actually happened was the United States invaded a sovereign country, the Confederate States of America, and conquered it through a war. I tend to look back on that period as the end of the Republic of the United States and the beginning of the Empire of the United States. So you have the United States conquering the Confederate States of America and then moving on to conquer many other places. And now we have this gigantic empire on the world that, quite frankly, can no longer be afforded. But he makes a good point in that if a war was the end-all be-all and what would settle any political question, then absolutely. The great World War II examples that he mentions there. But think of any other examples. Hell, even the country that the original 13 colonies separated from, they had an actual referendum in one of their divisions, Scotland, to leave. And if that had been successful, it would have happened. Think about that. That would have happened. However, however many hundreds of years ago, when England actually conquered Scotland, I guess now they don't think that actually settled the question. So anyway, very interesting. We'll talk about on the next edition. We'll start with the whole idea of, quote, like the federal government won't let Texas leave. Well, we'll see about that. And I'm not sure it'll be a matter of won't let or letting, because we're quickly careening down a path of national bankruptcy. So one way or the other, it's either going to be states leaving to take care of their own finances, their own interior, or it's going to be the United States being forced to do that, forced to shrink its empire because it'll no longer be able to afford it. Something's going to happen, and what we advocate here on the Feed Bandit podcast is for us to take care of ourselves, our families, and our state, so that we're not dragged down into the abyss by the dying crab of Mordor, DC. We go ahead and take care of ourselves right now and become that shining city on a hill that everyone can look up to. We have a chance, but we got to take it. The longer we wait, the harder it'll be. And the longer we wait, the chances of us actually succeeding at it diminish every second. So anyway, with that, leave you with some food for thought as far as that goes on this edition of the Leave the Swamp series. And we'll stay tuned for the next one when we talk about the arguments of why the federal government won't let Texas leave. That should be a doozy on the next edition. So stay tuned. And I will leave y'all, and I just want to remind y'all to, support those small businesses around wherever you hunt. Support the local feed store. Take care of yourself. Take care of your family first. But then after you've taken care of all that stuff, remember, Texas above all else. All right. I will see y'all in the next one. Y'all take care.
Well, I hope the bandits gave you an interesting episode that either entertained or educated you. Or better yet, both. Hell, I told them this podcasting thing looks harder to do than defeating Santa Anna. So if you would, please help them out by sharing it with all your like-minded friends to help the bandits get the word out. And don't forget to check us out at feedbandit.com and grab some gear and apparel to support the cause of Texas. Remember, Texas, above all else, preserve the tradition, protect the legacy. Finally, as I said some time ago on the eve of the great battle, and I vigorously repeat here again, be men, be free men, that your children may bless their father's name. Well, fellow bandit, until next time.